I'm Alec Farquhar from the Disability and Work Canada Steering Committee, and I'm very, very pleased to be introducing our keynote speaker and commentator for today, day one. And the focus will be to look at the challenges and opportunities for progress on employment of persons with disabilities, but through the lens of how the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities can contribute. I'm very, very pleased to have the privilege of introducing the Honorable Bob Ray and our commentator, Steve Estey. Bob's resume is in the conference materials, and we're not going to be reviewing everyone's resume in detail, but I do want to say that Bob is now Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations, which gives him a unique perspective on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and how that might apply and help move us forward. Bob has a distinguished career in public service, both at the federal and provincial level, and he's been elected to parliaments, federal and provincial, he notes, 11 times since it all began. But I have to say, I remember Bob for something else. I think back in my mind to a long time ago when we were young law students, and we sat together in a hot room on the second floor of the West End Y in Toronto, Ontario. And we were both trying to help immigrant injured workers whose lives had been really shattered by workplace disabilities. And I can see Bob in my mind's eye, spending hour on hour listening to stories, trying to help people navigate, trying to help people put their lives back together. And I believe he's taken that spirit of public service all through his career, and he'll be bringing it to his remarks today. Our format is going to be that Bob will speak for about 15 minutes. Then Steve Estey will comment for around 8 minutes, and we'll hopefully leave just a short time at the end for Bob to respond and perhaps make some closing remarks. Now, Steve Estey, again, we're very fortunate to have Steve. Steve's currently a consultant, but when he was with Disabled Peoples International, he played a crucial role for Canada in the initial development and then the implementation phase of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, both internationally and also its implementation in Canada. So Steve has a unique perspective, and I think he'll bring a lot to his comments. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to Bob, and thank you, Bob, for being here, and we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Alec. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And as I will mention in my speech, I also remember those days in my long association with Alec. And I was also very pleased to hear the comments of Stephen today. I think they also left a very important message to all of us. I want you to know that the issues that you're discussing matter a lot to me personally and professionally for the reasons that Alec has described. I began my career in the 70s as a law student advocating for immigrant workers injured on the job, mostly at that time in blue-collar factory and construction jobs. In those days, many of these injured workers who still had so much to offer our Canadian economy, and I have many of their faces and their personalities very clearly in my mind's eye, they were not given the support they needed to return to work. The psychological dimension of their disabilities was also given very, very short shrift, often seen as a sign of personal weakness. So I was inevitably, like many of you, witness to many individual tragedies as people who had always worked and contributed were excluded, and they were often consigned to poverty. As we all know, persons with disabilities have experienced major barriers to inclusion and to employment for a long time. The human and financial cost of exclusion of persons with disabilities is staggering. One of our hosts today, Emil Tampa, has estimated in his work that the financial cost of exclusion is equivalent to around 17% of Canada's GDP. It's a huge number, with the benefits of increased labor force participation being at least 3% of GDP. Again, a huge number. So there's also enormous economic opportunity that's here. Over many years, disability organizations, civil society partners, activists, and governments have addressed these barriers, and they've tried to develop programs and strategies. Some have addressed the employment of persons with disabilities more generally, while others have focused on specific disabilities such as visual or hearing impairment or mental health. And I've played a role in this myself in the work that our government did between 1990 and 1995. All of this has given us much to learn from. But this conference is taking place in the context of an additional challenge, the COVID-19 pandemic. All of the anecdotal reports and the survey data show that many persons with disabilities have either lost their jobs or face the threat of losing them. This is in addition to the challenges of navigating transportation and disability supports in the context of COVID-19. This all poses additional challenges, but also open up opportunities as the economic recovery continues. So what role can the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, what we call for short the CRPD, play in all of this? Well, first and foremost, international conventions give a higher profile to issues and inspire governmental and civil society action at many levels. I know you're going to be hearing later on from Minister Qualtrough about this. If you think back to the dark times of the Second World War and the Holocaust, one of the most important outcomes of these terrible events was the formation of the UN and especially the approval of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This provided a framework to build a better world. Now, we all know there's been a tremendous evolution of thinking on human rights since that time, with the addition of important treaties, mechanisms to advance the rights of all people. Since 2006, people living with disabilities have seen their rights specifically recognized, with the CRBT highlighting the universal and interdependent nature of human rights, as disability is often one intersecting factor with other forms of discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion. This means that the CRPD has become part of the further evolution of international thinking, providing a focus and priority on what we hope will become a very comprehensive approach to disability and to inclusion. For Canada, this gives us a new lens for looking at potential solutions. Governments and civil society must be mindful of the commitments made when Canada ratified the CRPD, as well as the optional protocol. One of your partner organizations, the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, played a vital role as the civil society organization representing Article 27, employment, as the first review of Canada's progress on implementing the CRPD by the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In the review that took place with input from civil society organizations, the committee's concluding observations included this recommendation, and I'm quoting: adopt a policy on the employment of persons with disabilities, including Indigenous persons with disabilities, that guarantees access to employment, promotes work in open, inclusive, and accessible markets and environments, equal opportunities and gender equality, and provides for reasonable accommodation for persons with disabilities at work. Later in 2017, you organized the first Disability and Work Conference. I understand that the UN committee report sparked discussion about the fact that there was now a need for a clear policy, and you quickly realized that what was preferred was in fact a strategy. This led to the development of the very strategy that today's conference is now addressing. And it also laid the foundation for the recent throne speech commitment to the development of a, quote, robust employment strategy for Canadians with disabilities. At a more detailed level, the CRPD provides recourse under some circumstances for addressing specific policy issues. For example, one of your partner organizations, the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Groups, I met Steve Mattis today, is using the CRPD framework to raise concerns about the approach to determining economic loss benefits for injured workers. This is an issue that I did work on several years ago myself. Finally, the CRPD gives us as Canadians a window on the strategic conversations and learnings all around the world. Some of these are hosted by the UN and will be again in person as part of the regular cycle of work around all the conventions. Some are organized by the various civil society organizations and government networks. We'll be having those next week virtually. We have much to learn from other countries who are on the same journey and who are using the same convention framework. We've turned a local, a provincial, a national dialogue into an international dialogue. And this is extremely important. You know, I'm aware that some Canadians are cynical about the role and value of the UN and even of conventions and other initiatives. I'm a realist about the limitations and challenges of working at the UN. Even though I've only been here for 4 months, I get that. But I believe strongly that there are many countries and civil society players who are sincerely and creatively striving to use the UN conventions and processes to make progress on vital issues. And that's the approach that I'm taking. I want to assure you that we take this enormously seriously here at the UN mission in New York, and I know my colleagues in Geneva do as well. First, in the speech from the throne, you have a commitment to develop a disability inclusion action plan. You can build on this. You can contribute to it. I've discussed it with the minister. I can tell you she's very serious about it. Your strategy, which you created in a broad community process, should influence the government's work on its own strategy. Second, I believe you're on the right track with your efforts to build a consensus-based strategy. I know sometimes this is controversial because people say, well, should it be a consensus or should it be something that's mandated, that's legally required? I think you need both. I think you need mandatory requirements that have their place, but you also need to get people on board. You need to get governments on board, employers on board, and you need to make sure they're committed to it and understand why it's important. A big part of civil society buy-in is a labor-employer collaboration. And I'm pleased to see that your conference highlights some very good examples of this. I know that the head of the Chamber of Commerce and the head of the CLC are going to be discussing these issues, and that's critically important. Finally, I just would recommend that you make sure your approach is, as we say, intersectional. Just an example, through my own work on Indigenous issues, I've learned a lot about the additional barriers faced by Indigenous people, which of course includes persons with a disability. This means that for Indigenous people, for racialized minorities and others who have additional challenges, an intersectional approach, dealing with all of the problems together, understanding the complex challenges that individuals face, not being afraid to address each and every one of them. These must be used to address the very complexity of the priorities and situations. And finally, and perhaps most important, and I know I don't have to tell you this because everything your organization does is based on this principle, but really I'm preaching to others who might be listening as well. And that is listen to the voices of persons with disabilities. Make sure they're involved in all phases of your strategy development. Early in my career, I learned a lot from injured workers, as Alec has said, just by hearing their stories, just by listening, and then figuring out how do we take the human footsteps forward? How do we help make a difference? That same kind of approach is vital to your work today. I want to wish you the very best with your conference and the important work which will follow it. I'm really pleased to have had the opportunity to join you today. I just want to, in addition to my prepared remarks, I just have a couple of things I want to say in addition to that. I think that disability inclusiveness is one of the last frontiers of thinking and feeling that we have to go through as a society. We have to see people as they really are and understand that we all share a common humanity. No matter what the disability, we share that. And I often say to friends, and particularly now as I get a little older, For those people who say, well, why would I worry about those people? I always say to people, careful, just understand something. Those people are going to become you people very, very quickly. We're a footstep away from a disability. We're an accident away from a disability. We can age ourselves into disability. Disease can come at one morning that wasn't there the night before. We need to understand how this is something that affects all of us. It isn't about them and us, it's about us. We have to be a society that truly celebrates our humanity, that celebrates our disabilities, that celebrates our failures as well as our successes, and that celebrates our challenges. These are challenges we face together. And the reason I think you can use the convention is because it allows us to broaden the conversation. It allows us to learn from others. And it allows us to see that we're part not just of a local or provincial or national movement, we're part of an international movement, a movement for inclusiveness, a movement to make sure that no one is left behind. No one is pushed aside. No one is marginalized. No one is seen as being anything other than fully and completely human. Thank you very much for this chance to be with you. I really appreciate it.
Hi there. Sorry, I had some technical problems here. It's a very, very challenging task that I've been given here today. I hope I measure up. I think that my first line of thinking is I was offered 8 minutes to make a response, but you guys can listen to me any old time. You don't get to talk to Ambassador Ray very much. So I'm going to try to keep my 8 minutes to about 4 or maybe 5. I wanted to thank you, sir, for your comments. Very thoughtful and obviously from a great depth of experience. So we really appreciate that. And I think I'd like to ask you to draw on that experience with regard to the convention, because as I was saying to you before we went live, I've been involved with work around the convention since it was drafted 2003, 2004. And in those days, one of the big tensions, one of the big questions was about monitoring the convention. There was a lot of concern when we were drafting about setting up a new treaty body or a new experts committee. There are many of these experts committees, and every one of them costs money. So you're in a room where governments are negotiating and they're talking about putting new processes in place and things. And basically what they're really talking about is making commitments to spend more money. So there was a real push to minimize the reporting responsibilities around the Disability Convention. And that really was the central tension through the negotiations 2003, 2004, 2005 was, what are the obligations going to be for countries when they actually ratify this thing and have to implement it? And as you mentioned, Ambassador Ray, the key piece here is that Canada and other countries must report on how they're meeting their obligations on a regular basis to an experts committee in Geneva. That happens for us every 4 years. And as someone who's been involved in that process myself, it's absolutely mind-boggling because we're reporting on 30 articles from 14 jurisdictions, and we get 10,000 words to make our point. So it's a very high-level piece, I think you would say. But one of the key innovations of the Disability Convention is that it sets out a mechanism not just to do international monitoring, but it talks about domestic monitoring. And it sets up a new mechanism in the UN system for countries to domestically monitor their obligations under the CRPD. And when the Liberal government came into power in 2015, one of the things that we talked to them about initially was actually moving on this domestic monitoring of the convention. And I'm very pleased to say that as part of the accessibility legislation last year, the Government of Canada designated the Canadian Human Rights Commission as the domestic monitoring mechanism around the treaty. But as you said, Ambassador Ray, and this is my question to you, my point, a key is always the voice of people with disabilities in this process. The CRPD in Article 33 talks about domestic monitoring. It talks about a human rights monitoring body, but it also talks about a role for civil society. And what I would like to know from you, Ambassador Ray, is how you think we, as Canadian civil society organizations, can get the Government of Canada to engage with us on this, because while they have provided resources for the Canadian Human Rights Commission to figure out what domestic monitoring means for them, they have provided no such resources for civil society organizations. So I think that as we try to move forward and take your words to heart, the key question for us, for me at least, is how do we fully engage as civil society organizations in the domestic monitoring of the convention? So I'd really welcome your thoughts on that, and I appreciate the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. I know that the minister will be here and speaking to the conference as well, and I think it's important for you to focus that on her as well. Just a couple of things I would say. The first one is, one of the arguments that you might want to make is that, globally we spend about $240 million or so on foreign assistance that is specifically targeted to dealing internationally, globally with disability issues. So I would expect that some of what we're doing with that money is increasing capacity in a number of societies to support advocacy groups who will be attempting to increase public awareness in their countries on disability issues. And I certainly believe, as a citizen, that if the Canadian Human Rights Commission is going to be given the task, which it has been by the government, to be the reporting agency, then there has to be a process created whereby we will be monitoring this situation together as it relates to Canada. Because one of the things we're clearly doing is we're also increasing the capacity globally to do this, so we would need to do it at home as well. So I think I'll leave my answer to that, to make that basic point. I've given you a free piece of advocacy advice in terms of how you can encourage the government. If we're doing it in other countries, why wouldn't we be doing it here?
So Steve, do you have more comments or questions? And we've got a little bit more time here. We have till 1:20.
I'm unmuting myself. Sorry, that's one of the hazards of being a deaf person. You can't tell when you're muted or you're not muted because it's all the same to me. Yeah. In any case, I think that's really valuable advice, Ambassador Ray, and I really appreciate it. I mean, you're quite right. We do quite a lot of things in other countries to support civil society organizations around the convention specifically. We haven't really done that in Canada, but certainly we can point to that as an example, and I look forward to the opportunity to do that. So thank you very kindly for that. Alex?
So Bob, maybe I could add a question and give you an opening for some final remarks. You've opened up some very important territory, and the convention as well. Do you have any advice on how we think about it? There are almost 400 people watching this now. Many are important players in civil society, but there are also parts of civil society we haven't reached. Any advice on how best to engage, how best to reach out, how best to make this real? I think you've got a long career, and you've tried to get traction on a lot of different issues throughout that career, and you've probably learned a lot about what works and doesn't work.
Well, at the risk of being repetitive, I guess what I would say is, to me, one of the key challenges in social policy generally is there are what I call us issues, and then there are them and us issues. Us issues, I mean, healthcare is a classic example of an us issue, where everybody recognizes that we want universal healthcare in Canada because we understand that potentially we're all going to need it. One of the reasons why I believe that we've made a critical mistake in our country in underestimating the importance of housing as a basic right is that we've allowed housing to become a them and us issue. We're going to build social housing for other people. People don't see it as something that we're doing for ourselves. And I think the key argument on disability is to really demonstrate to everybody that disability affects everybody. It is not a them and us issue. It's not about a small minority of people who, you know, we don't have to include them. We'll just do stuff for them at the end. And I think the whole purpose about the campaign on disability inclusion is bringing it right into the center of the discussion, putting it ahead of all the others. And I think the key is, the most important way to do this is to make it so clear in everything we say and do that in dealing with disability, we're not dealing with the problems of other people. We're dealing with the problems that either do affect ourselves very directly as loved ones, as caregivers, as people with disabilities ourselves, and certainly as people who one day will have a disability. And I think this is a point that we just have to keep on reinforcing and get it to be embraced as an issue that includes everyone. And that's what, to me, that's what inclusivity means. And I'm so pleased that the government has described as Carla Qualtro's job as the Minister for Disability and Inclusion, because we are included, but it needs to be made crystal clear as to why that is and how it is that disability happens to anybody and everybody in some way. And I think that's one of the key things we have to keep on reinforcing. You know, COVID-19 is not a leveler. People say it's a leveler. It's not a leveler. It's a magnifier. It's a revealer. It's like a low tide. The tide goes out and you see everything that's on the sand, and it's not always pretty. But that's what COVID-19 has done. And I think both nationally and globally, one of the big challenges we're facing now is getting everyone to understand how solidarity is actually in our self-interest. That solidarity is not something we're doing for other people. It's something we're actually doing for ourselves. And I think there's nothing expresses this more clearly than the reason why we have to take disability not just more seriously, but put it at the core of what we're all about. And I think that's one of the most fundamental expressions of solidarity that we can think of. And I think that we're in a moment now in the world where we risk seeing all of the progress we've made on sustainable development goals, all the progress we've made on increasing opportunities for people around the world. We risk seeing all of that just disappear under the economic and social impact of the pandemic. And I think we have to, this is a moment, I don't call it a reset. This is a moment of coming to truth about what our societies are all about. And solidarity and sustainability of our societies are absolutely critical to the survival of the planet, to biodiversity, to the survival of the species, as how we go forward as a human race. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that, because this impact is that serious. And this opportunity is also that great. And I think that's the opportunity that we now have to advance that agenda here in Canada in very progressive ways. We can go forward leaps and bounds compared to where we were before. I think it's critically important for us to make every effort to do that.
Thank you very much, Bob. And perhaps Steve, any last words? And then we'll wrap it up.
I had one last quick comment, Ambassador Ray, and I always take the opportunity when I meet with somebody from the Canadian Embassy to make the point that the government of Canada and the Canadian mission has never really been involved in the workings of the Disability Convention since the negotiations finished in 2006. And as you know, every year there's a conference of states parties to the convention. It's happening actually next week in New York on the 30th, and then virtually the 3 days following. Usually it takes place in June of the year for 3 or 4 days. And the way these things go is that each of the UN regions, each of the 5 UN regions, designates one mission to be part of an executive group that they call the Bureau, to be responsible for the annual Conference of States Parties. And I have asked each ambassador that I've met since 2006 in New York to consider asking Canada to become part of the Bureau for the next Conference of States Parties. So I will make that request to you as well, because I really think that for all of the reasons that you've said, the time is exactly right for Canada to take some leadership in the role of the convention. And I would be really delighted to see you do that. And I would be more than thrilled to support you in any way I could.
Thank you very much. Just to say on that, I've just turned to, while you were speaking, I was turning the page to see my schedule next week. I'm booked in to be there on the 30th. I'm there for 3 hours on the morning of the 30th. I'm booked again to be there at another event on the 1st. We take this very seriously. I've asked my staff to make sure that we're involved, and I'll follow up with you on the question of being on the steering committee. I'm quite happy to do that. I think it's very important that Canada be front and center on this issue.
Thank you both. We're about to be shut off at 1:20. And Bob, thank you. And Steve, thank you. This has been a really, really important launch.
I appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Alec. Thank you, Steve.